When I was invited to this conference, I was both very excited and realized that I was entering a territory that I wasn't familiar with. I know a tiny little bit about the history of Islamic studies from Dr. Jamil Aydin's work in Japan, because I have to read everything he writes. And so I had a little bit of a sense of that. I knew very little about the Bridge Between Two Easts project, so I've learned a lot about that since I came here, through the conference presentations, through the conversations. But I'm still interested in whether there is a possibility to at least think more critically about the role that English as the language of communication at a conference might play, and beyond the use of English, which comes with its own use of words, terminology, and categories that, of course, are related to the history of the field of Islamic studies and the history of Sufism as a field of study for Europeans and for Americans. And so beyond language itself, to think about methodological challenges, which was the theme of the conference, to think about those explicitly as actual challenges. So I saw yesterday, especially in many of the presentations, repeated references to foundational scholarship in Sufi studies, sometimes by scholars who were in the room, like Professor Carl Ernst and Professor William Chittick. Bruce Lawrence has contributed to that scholarship as well. And perhaps not enough, in my view, of an interrogation of what it means for scholars in other parts of the world, particularly Japan and Turkey, who, which I think is historically interesting, are both countries that were not directly colonized by Europe, but of course were very, very much impacted, and also both engaged in self-imposed modernization reforms, which included academia and ideas about what it means to participate in academic research and create academic institutions and educational institutions. And so I'm interested in whether it is possible to, at the very least, more explicitly talk about this legacy, not as the only framework available. So to perhaps think about whether Turkey and the longer history of the Ottoman Empire and Japan both have epistemological histories and traditions that might move the study of Sufism in a somewhat different direction, or at least add a dimension to it that it currently, in my view, doesn't have. So I think the symposium and the conference are a wonderful opportunity. I wish for, as I said, some more explicit discussion of these questions, and I very much appreciate in all the work that I've seen happening over the years since I became the Kenan Rifai professor at UNC, that this scholarly work is never disconnected from the larger global political context that we live in, that there is a clear acknowledgement, both in the context of Turkey and in the broader international reach, through the chairs, through the centers, the Kenan Rifai centers and the chair positions, to engage globally through Sufism, which I think is a novel methodology, all the issues of the contemporary world, especially ideas about Islam and Muslims and the continuous disenfranchisement of Muslims, the continuous political conflicts that revolve around ideas about what Islam is and what it isn't. So this work on the ground, so to speak, from teaching students in various locations, undergraduate students, to helping train graduate students and then scholars, to holding these meetings, are all, I think, very much on the groundwork that is not what Americans call the ivory tower of academia, that is disconnected from the real world. my own journey as a teacher and scholar at the University of North Carolina has been really interesting. I know that there was some concern in the negotiations about creating the chair position, that Jabal Noor Hoxha especially wanted this position to be a Sufi studies position, and because of the various really interesting but also very complicated politics of a public university in the United States, it is more broadly defined as an Islamic studies position. So I'm the Kenan Rifai Scholar at the moment of Islamic Studies, and when I become a full professor, inshallah, one day, I will actually be the Kenan Rifai Chair for Islamic Studies, not for Sufi studies only. And I was thinking when James Morris was presenting earlier that if I had to answer the question how I incorporate Sufism or Sufi studies into my teaching, I will start with that, into my teaching, I do it differently, in part because I'm at a public university, so his approach is very specific to the context of the college that he teaches at, where it is actually possible to talk in religious terms about religious practices in ways that I can't. But for me, as I said in my own presentation, Sufism permeates the fabric of Muslim life. And so in some way, all my teaching is related to Sufism because we encounter it. We encounter it when we talk about religious practices, when we talk about music, when we talk about poetry, when we talk about architecture. In all of these arenas, when we talk about the interpretation of the Quran, when we talk about which hadith are important for which groups of Muslims. So for me, it's a thread that runs through really all of my teaching, whether it is focused on American Muslims, which is an important part of my work, whether it is the study of women and gender in Muslim societies and communities. Sufism is in a really interesting way always there without always being named as such. And as a scholar, I have come to realize that so much of the work that older scholars have done has been about drawing boundaries around what Sufism is and then in some ways also what it isn't. And I am personally, honestly, not so interested in those boundaries. I actually think it is totally boundless in the sense that it can be found everywhere. And that's in some ways harder to teach, especially because students want definitions and they want boundaries because that's how they hold on to knowledge in some ways. But at the same time, the realization that it is everywhere and all around them in their study of Islam and in their exploration of Islam also opens up possibilities that they don't always initially see. I had a very interesting student last semester in my Women and Gender and Islam course who wrote in a journal halfway through the semester that she realized when we were talking about women in Sufism at some point that the spiritual community that she belongs to, which is not Muslim, actually has a Sufi lineage. So it's one of the examples of a community, and she didn't know that, but through describing particular practices, we watched some videos, we discussed what women's roles are in various practices, she came to realize that some of the things she does in this community, which is sort of universal Sufi community, are in fact connected at the very least. And to her, that was a really important realization. So I found that to be rather powerful, actually, because she opened up about it after this teaching unit and then sort of continuously wanted to talk to me about how she could find out more about these connections. And yeah, in terms of my own research, I would say that, again, for me, Sufism is not a thing with boundaries. I very much define my own relationship to God through what would be described probably as Sufi ideas, without me having initially called them that. Like Qayyim, who said yesterday that he encountered Islam in some ways through Sufism. So my journey is a little bit more complicated, but it touched something in me that wasn't reached by other aspects that I was studying when I was a student. And I see Sufism pretty much everywhere, the same way I see gender everywhere in my research. And so I would say that even where it looks like my work doesn't focus primarily on Sufism, that dimension of it is always there, if nothing else as one of the sort of guiding sources of energy, and the passion that I have for my research. And I was reminded frequently at the conference of this notion of ihsan, which for me is not only bettering oneself, but also bettering the world. And so I see my connection as a mandate to do something with my research that goes beyond creating more knowledge. It is very much, it's no secret that I identify as a scholar activist, as someone who produces knowledge, but is also very interested in how that knowledge might change the world, and not just change it, but make it better. So I don't see a contradiction between my own yearning for somewhere else and something else, and being present here, and not only taking responsibility for the impact that scholarship can have, but also actively applying it in order to make the world a better place. And I see that very much in line with the program of the Karim Foundation, in the spirit of Hazrat Kenan Rifai. And I hope, I don't know, but I hope that the very, very generous people in the community see it that way as well.